In the last two lectures, we looked at a theme, or two themes in the Bible. First, God's dwelling with his people in the Garden of Eden, then symbolically and actually in the tabernacle and temple. And then we saw that theme of his dwelling with his people will come to fruition in the new heaven and the new earth. We also looked at the biblical theme of God's relationship with his people expressed in terms of marriage. Now, in this lecture and the next, I want to look at another important theme, perhaps one of the most important and vexing themes that there is, namely the issue of God's sovereignty, humanity's responsibility, and the existence of sin and evil. The existence of evil and suffering is one of the most important issues, and one of the things why a lot of people say they don't believe in God. They say, how can a good God allow all of this evil? Well, the Bible deals with all of this in great detail. Now, so we need to look at this, and there are a number of things we're going to consider. First, God is sovereign over everything and is actively at work accomplishing his plan. Now, the Bible shows that God is sovereign over everything. In the beginning, he's the creator. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But he didn't just leave us there to then work things out on our own. No, he is active in the world to accomplish his plan. He says, I know the end from the beginning. Now, this is known as the doctrine of God's providence, specifically that he continues to exercise divine energy whereby he preserves his creatures and he operates in and through us to bring about everything to pass, to bring about his appointed end. Therefore, the Bible says that he creates the mountains, he creates the wind, he makes dawn into darkness, he governs the sun, the moon, and the stars, he governs the animals and the plants. He's also sovereign over the affairs of people. Ultimately, he is in charge of life and death, including birth defects, sickness, the death of the innocent. He raises some up, he puts others down. He stirs up people's spirits, puts thoughts in people's minds, and turns people's hearts. And in the book, I give scriptural references for all of these things. Consequently, the Bible says in Psalm 136, verse 6, whatever the Lord pleases, he does, in heaven and on earth. And God states in Isaiah 46, verses 10 and 11, that he declares the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things which have not been done, saying, my purpose will be established, and I will accomplish my good pleasure. Truly I have spoken. Truly I will bring it to pass. I have planned it. Surely I will do it. But the situation is a little more complex or nuanced than that. And the Bible gives what you might call a dual explanation for all events. Despite the absoluteness and the comprehensiveness of God's plan and his decree and his acting to bring things to completion, God also respects people's integrity as human beings. He does not control people as if they were puppets or program people as if they were robots. People we're able to think our own thoughts, and we're able to make real choices. And therefore, the Bible repeatedly presents a dual explanation for events. God is sovereign and has ordained all events. And that, in one sense, explains why things happen. And yet that is compatible with and does not in any way diminish people's responsibility for the choices that they make and the things that they do. Because the choices people make and the things that people do, in another sense, is a full explanation for all events. This is known as the doctrine of concurrence. In other words, the cooperation of the divine power with all of the subordinate powers, namely natural laws, the climate, human beings, angels, etc., etc. So God's working in and through his creatures, and yet human beings are making real choices. This concurrence brings about God's plan. Now, this doctrine of concurrence tells us two things. First, that the powers of nature do not work by themselves alone, simply on their own inherent power. Rather, God is operative. Secondly, these secondary causes, what we do, what the wind does, and so on, are real and are not to be regarded simply as the operative power of God. In other words, the pantheistic notion is that all is one and everything is just a part of God. That is not correct. In other words, in some way, God works in and through his creatures, both humans and spirits, to accomplish his plan. Now, admittedly, there is some mystery in this. God is infinite. He's omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent. And yet we are real, but we are finite. We do not understand everything. And this interaction between the infinite and the finite, there's going to be some mystery in this. In another course, particularly in our course on Christianity and Islam, we talk about the Trinity. There's only one God, but consisting of three persons. It's not three gods. Yes, there is some mystery in that. But in our book on Christianity and Islam, we have a whole section on the Trinity, showing how the concept clearly arises from the Bible. And then we give examples from nature and existence that show that the Trinity is reasonably explainable and understandable. It's something similar to that when we come to this issue of God's sovereignty, human responsibility, and the existence of sin and evil. And so in keeping with this dual explanation of events, Paul said in Philippians 2, verses 12 and 13, he said, "Work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure." So notice, God is at work in us, both to will and to do, and yet Paul is saying, you work out your salvation in the choices you make and the things you do. So a couple of other comments need to be made about this interdependent divine and human relationship. First, it is a relationship of unequals. It is an asymmetrical relationship. God is God and we are not. Secondly, it is a paradox that defies complete understanding. But as I say, God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. He has a plan for the world. He is sovereign, and he is actualizing that plan. He has given creatures the ability, human beings, to make real choices and take real actions for which we are responsible. And given the relationship between God and his creatures, as described above, God being sovereign and yet creatures having their integrity as creatures, the relationship that I've been talking about could not be otherwise. We may not fully understand it, but it could not be otherwise. Now, in the book, I have a table that shows a list of events, and it has a list, and in all of these events, in one passage, the event is attributed to God. In another passage, the same event is attributed to secondary causes. And I list over 80 events in the Bible, both Old and New Testament. For example, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. In one passage, it's attributed to God. In another passage, it's attributed to Pharaoh. The defeat of Sihon, the defeat of Bashan, the death of Joab. Just passage after passage, event after event. The success of Cyrus, the destruction of Egypt, drought in the land, casting Jonah into the sea, the crucifixion of Jesus, salvation of believers, and event after event, from Genesis to Revelation, I have listed over 80 events that are attributed in the Bible both to God and to secondary agents like people or the devil. Now, we're looking at the existence of sin and evil. And we need to recognize that a good, omnipotent God is necessary to even talk coherently about the existence of good and evil. As I say, many people find it difficult to reconcile how God can be entirely good and absolutely sovereign and yet reign over a world containing sin and evil. However, that argument assumes that some things are, in fact, objectively evil. You see, to say that something is evil is to make a moral judgment. And moral judgments make no sense outside of a moral standard. Evil cannot be real if morals are relative. Evil is real, however, and that's why people object to it. Therefore, objective moral standards must exist. And with respect to the sources of moral standards of good and evil, a morally perfect God is the only adequate standard that makes sense of the existence of sin and evil to begin with. In other words, there needs to be an adequate standard for determining whether something is good or evil, right or wrong, moral or immoral. And the only adequate ground is, and standard, is a morally good and perfect God. Because many people today, certainly in the West, think that good and evil are simply relative. They're societal constructs and so on. That one, either it's up to the individual to determine what's good or not, or it's up to society to determine what is good or not. And what's true for one group, for one tribe, for one society, may not be true for another. Well, if you believe that, then it's kind of like what's said in the book of Judges. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And what was the result? Rampant evil. Because if I get to determine what's good and evil in my eyes, or if a society says this is good and another society says that is bad, then there is no way for anyone to logically and coherently say that anything is truly evil. For example, if you believe, if people have the right to say, well, pedophilia, having sex with young children, that's okay. Okay, then if it's up to the individual to decide, then no one can say that a pedophile is wrong. For example, if a person says, I'm a man, I believe that I should have sex with anyone who I want, then there's no way to say that rape is wrong. Or if it's up to me to decide, that person wronged me, I have the right to kill him. If it's up to the individual to determine morals, then you can't say that murder is wrong. And it's the same if morals are based upon what society says. For example, in the 1930s and 40s, Nazi Germany said, the Jews are evil, we need to eliminate the Jews. That was their society. That was the theology of Nazism. And if it's up to individual cultures and societies to determine that, then there's no way that anyone can coherently and logically say that what the Nazis did in sending millions of people to gas chambers was wrong. Likewise, the genocide in Rwanda. If it's up to the tribe to decide, if the Hutus say the Tutsis are cockroaches and they should be eliminated, if it's up to society, to the culture, to the tribe to determine moral standards, then no one can say that the genocide was wrong. And so that's true for everything. The only way one can coherently determine that there is good and evil is if there is an omnipotent, omniscient, and good God. That is the God of the Bible. So so when people say something is good or evil, even though they may say it's up to the individual or up to society, and it's all relative, even to make the determination and say that something is good or evil, they are presupposing the Christian worldview. They may deny it formally, but the only adequate basis and standard for determining good and evil is God. And in fact, non-Christians even admit that. For example, non-Christian philosopher Richard Taylor says, the modern age, more or less repudiating the idea of a divine lawgiver, has nevertheless tried to retain the ideas of moral right and wrong without noticing that in casting God aside, they have also abolished the conditions of meaningfulness for moral right and wrong as well. The concept of moral obligation is unintelligible apart from the idea of God. Atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie says, the problem of evil does not, after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another. Consequently, the so-called problem of evil, the fact that evil exists, is actually a problem for the unbeliever, because the unbeliever cannot logically say that anything is evil at all. So that being said, as a Christian, I can make perfectly good sense out of my moral revulsion and condemnation of evil things like child abuse and murder and rape, because the Bible speaks against these things. The non-Christian cannot make any logical sense of those things and cannot logically condemn those things as evil. I can, because those things that I've just mentioned are inconsistent with the biblical and Christian worldview. That does not mean that I can explain why God does whatever he does in ordaining these things, but the problem of evil is a problem for the unbeliever, because knowing that God is omniscient, that he has a plan, and that he is good, then I know that God has a morally sufficient reason for ordaining and allowing that which he has ordained and allowed. He may not tell me much of the things he does not tell me, but I know from his character that even though I don't understand it, my mind is finite, yet he does have a good and sufficient reason. Now, we talked about there's an asymmetrical relationship between God and human beings, and this is reflected in the asymmetrical relationship of God's sovereignty over sin and evil. In other words, sin and evil exists in his world. He knows about it in advance. He has ordained these things to come to pass. But he is sovereign over sin and evil in a way that does not make him sinful or evil. Now, God, we know, is holy, just, righteous, and good. And we know that because God became a human being in the person of Jesus Christ. And Jesus is the perfect representation of the nature of God. Jesus never sinned, and even his enemies admit that. In fact, even in the Quran, it says that the only person who is holy and just and who never sinned is not Muhammad. Muhammad is condemned in the Quran and in the Hadith for his sins. But the Quran admits only Jesus never sinned and was never touched by the power of Satan. And so many people, because God is holy and just, try to shield God from any involvement with sin or evil at all. And they attribute all evil either to Satan or demons or to the individual sinner. And they say God had nothing to do with that. But that can't possibly be true if God is sovereign over everything. In some way, God is involved in this. And as I mentioned, and we will give some examples of this, but even events such as Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery, the crucifixion of Jesus, and other things involving sin and evil, God is involved in some way without himself being evil. Now, God, moral evil is not something that God created when he created other things, because it's not a substance at all. God created substances, including the world and people. He intended that we could act, and he made us able to act. But he did not directly make our actions, or he doesn't perform them. We do. Yes, he works in us, both to will and to do, but we are the ones who make the choices. And so God created agents who can act, but we bear the responsibility for what we choose to do. Now, he does not stand behind evil in precisely the same way that he stands behind good actions. There's a certain distance preserved between God and his people when they sin. In other words, although we may lack the categories necessary for full understanding of this, we must insist that divine ultimacy stands behind good and evil asymmetrically. In other words, God is responsible for evil in that he is sovereign over everything and declares the end from the beginning. He has ordained this all-comprehensive plan for everything, including the evil that exists. But his relationship with good and evil is asymmetric. In other words, the evil that takes place is not outside the bounds of his sovereignty, but it is not morally chargeable to him. It is always morally, the evilness of the evil is always morally chargeable to the secondary causes, people, the devil, whatever. On the other hand, God stands behind good in such a way that it takes place within his sovereignty, but the good is chargeable to him, and secondarily, the good is chargeable to the secondary agents. In other words, God is not responsible for evil in such a way that he is the author of the evilness of evil or the sinfulness of sin. And so, for example, we see this in the book of James, because in James 1, James describes how sin arises. And in James 1, verses 13 through 15, it says, "Let no one say when he is tempted, 'I am being tempted by God,' for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then, when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death." Now, God places us in circumstances to test and try us, including circumstances where we may be tempted to sin, and in circumstances where he knows we will in fact sin. Yet he is not the one inducing us to sin. It's not like God or the Holy Spirit is whispering in our ear and saying, "You see that money there, steal it," or "You see that person there, commit adultery with him or with her." God is not tempting us. He's not inducing us. He's not encouraging us to sin, even though he places us in circumstances where we are tempted to sin. The temptation, according to James, comes from within us, or from a secondary source, namely Satan. Satan may whisper in our ear, or a demon may whisper in our ear, but ultimately, the choice lies with us. Who are we going to listen to? Yes, we have the power of indwelling sin in us, but morally, evil deeds stem from human desires. Desires in and of themselves are not evil, but when they are aroused so as to lead us to disobey God's prescribed moral norms, then we sin. And so we basically always do what we want. Desire is not the culprit because will, reason, and emotion enter into the process. But James is saying that temptation and sinful deeds begin with our desires, and ultimately we are responsible because we make the choices. Now, God, and as we'll see later on, God permits and ordains sin, not for the evilness or the sinfulness of the sin, but for wise, holy, and excellent ends and purposes. And so, for example, it's possible to know 100% that evil is going to occur, but yet God uses it for good. And so, for example, God did not force Adam and Eve to do evil, but he created them with the freedom and permitted Satan's presence in the garden, fully knowing that they would choose evil, and knowing what he would do in his redemptive plan, that this ultimately would serve a greater good. Now, we talked about the doctrine of concurrence, and the concurrence means that God and the secondary agent may have different motives for the exact same thing. For example, I mentioned how Joseph's brothers sold Joseph into slavery. Yet when they finally got together again, Joseph in Genesis 50, verses 19 and 20, Joseph says this. Joseph said to his brothers, "Do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive." In other words, when it says God meant it for good, it's not that God saw Joseph's brothers selling Joseph into slavery and then said, "Oh, dear, what can I do to bring good out of this?" No, God was present even at the time that Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery. But God had one motive for that event, and the brothers had another motive. In Isaiah 10, beginning at verse 5, it says, "Woe to Assyria, the rod of my," God's, "anger, and the staff in whose hands is my indignation. I send Assyria against a godless nation, Israel, and commission it against the people of my fury, to capture booty and to seize plunder and to trample them down like mud in the streets." Verse 7, "Yet it, Assyria, does not so intend, nor does it plan so in its heart, but rather it is its purpose to destroy and cut off many nations. For it says, are not my princes all kings? Is not Kino like Carchemish, or Hamath like Arpad, or Samaria like Damascus? As my hand has reached to the kingdoms and of the idols, whose graven images are greater than those of Jerusalem and Samaria, shall I not do to Jerusalem and her images just as I have done to Samaria and her idols?" Verse 12, "So it will be that when the Lord has completed all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the fruit of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the pomp of his haughtiness." So again, God ordained that Assyria would attack Israel, but Assyria did not have the godly motive. It was thinking about itself. It had a different motive. And then look at the crucifixion of Christ himself. In the book of Acts, chapter 2, Peter says this in verses 22 and 23. "Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs, which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know. This man, delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. So it was part of God's foreordained plan that the crucifixion would happen, and yet it was sin. Godless men did it of their own choice. This is concurrence. They had different motives than God did. So I'm going to end this lecture now, but so far we've seen that God is sovereign. In one way, asymmetrically, he stands behind everything, including sin and evil, but not in a way that the evilness of the evil or the sinfulness of the sin is attributed to God himself. We will look at this in more detail in the next lecture.